Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, we are so happy to have as our guest Dr. Deborah Greenhut. Dr. Greenhut is the author of The Hoarder's Wife, and Dr. Greenhut got her BA in English from Middlebury College and then a PhD from my alma mater, Rutgers University. And then she pursued her original dream by becoming a writer, a teacher, and later a dean. And she actually produced way off Broadway production of Difficult Subjects, which was selected for the Best Plays of Strawberry Festival. And she also received the Princemer Poetry Prize. Today, we will be focusing on her newest book and her first novel called The Hoarder's Wife. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Deborah.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Please call me Deborah.
Okay. But let's go back in time and see, we're going to talk a lot about what is hoarding, because our show is about natural health. And, certainly hoarding is an issue when we come to mind-body issues that people deal with. But let's go back in time and let's look at little Deborah. And how did you become Dr. Deborah and an author?
Wow. I guess the earliest story I could tell you occurred when I was about 8 years old. I read a book called The Fairy Doll by Rummer Godden, and I wrote a poem right after it. I was so enthused. And I ran home to tell my mother I had decided what I wanted to be when I grew up, and that was an author. And my mother looked at me very seriously, and she said, "You better have a backup plan because you're not going to make any money." So she recommended I become a teacher. And while I was a little begrudging about it, those twin ideas became my dream jobs, teaching and writing.
So that was a happy outcome at the end.
Yes, it was. Thank you, Mom.
And actually, it's certainly not a bad idea. When I speak to people all the time, for instance, they say they're going to become an herbalist. And then we actually have a session called Career Paths in Natural Health. Because, there's a romantic involvement with things that really interest you. And then either maybe you don't have to make money. Maybe you have an inheritance. Maybe you have a rich husband or a rich wife who can support you. So you can just pursue your creative endeavors. But if you're one of those people who are going to have to pay bills, I think there needs to be a balance. What interests me and how can I move that in a way that it can support me financially? So I think it's wise that your mom brought it up.
I agree.
So you went to Rutgers, and what did you pursue at Rutgers?
Well, I have a PhD in English literature and drama, so that I kind of continued what I had started in college. And I guess I always knew I wanted to be a teacher of English and writing. So that was a pretty clear path for me for most of my days.
So that's, wonderful that you managed to be that. Now, what kind of dean were you?
Well, I was Associate Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at a community college in North Jersey. So I was an academic dean, right, primarily.
So
yes.
That's a big progress. And then you always wanted to be an author. And you wrote other things such as plays and poetry. But this book that we're talking about, The Hoarder's Wife, is your first novel.
That's right. I never really thought that I was going to write a novel. But after the breakup with my husband, I started thinking about my life and what had happened. And I first wanted to review it. So I actually wrote a memoir, which I decided I would not publish, and decided ultimately to adapt it as a novel so that I could tell that kind of story, because I think there's a great urgency about helping caregivers who are working with hoarders as their partners.
So that is a big thing. And what you just said, working with hoarders who are their partners, that certainly is deeply reflected in the name of your book, The Hoarder's Wife.
Yes, everyone wants to know what hoarding is like or living with hoarding is like. And I think sometimes our media, in their drive to find something shocking and appealing, will focus on the hoarding itself. And there's usually a person standing in the background who's not getting a lot of attention, but is kind of suffering in silence and really not sure what to do anymore. And I was that person.
So you were not necessarily the hoarder. You're the person who's has a relationship with the hoarder.
Right. I think if you stay with a hoarder through the worst level of it, you start to collect things maybe in self-defense too. But since I've moved on, hoarding is not my specialty.
You found out. I didn't share when I read your bio to our audience, but it is posted on our online archive that actually you talk about that now you live in a clean house in New Jersey.
That was my wish. That was my goal.
So when you say you were a hoarder's wife, were you a hoarder's wife, or is this more about, viewing your parents' relationship?
Well, it really wasn't that much about my parents, although I did go into the childhood of the character to try to figure out, well, first I figured it out for myself. What were the things in my life that compelled me to be a giver and to try to take care of people? And then I put those in a different form into the character Grace Berg's life in the book.
So how much of this book is biographical, or is it just a fictionist story with some aspects?
Well, I haven't really measured, but I think it follows pretty closely the track of my life, although Grace is a musician. And while I had some music training, I did not become a musician. So her hopes and aspirations are different from mine. And I think the ending is different from my life.
So in what ways? In what way is it different, and in what way is it the same?
Well, Grace was an academic, so I looked at how the job crunch during the 70s and 80s affected both of us. I would say there's a grain of truth in all the experiences in the book. My husband and I did try counseling. We did try to get some help for his hoarding and ADHD. He also had a number of other disorders, so it became a very complicated problem. And we did get divorced, just as Grace does, and we did. And unfortunately, both the character and my husband died of suicide. So those elements are true. But I would say that Grace responds a bit differently to those things.
So, yeah, because, it's an interpretive and it's creative writing. So it doesn't have to stick to, the particular script. But let's talk more about hoarding. Now, in the material that you sent me, there's a lot of beautiful things that people can look at on your site, which you can certainly give out. But you have a picture of a gentleman surrounded by books and actually holding a copy of your book.
Oh, that colleague of mine who developed a media kit for me set up these layouts to show the book, and she was trying to illustrate hoarding. And I do talk a little bit about book hoarders in the book as well, because as a graduate student, I became a little bit of a book hoarder myself, but it didn't block my doors or inconvenience me in terms of my life. I just always needed more bookshelves.
Right.
So the next book I'm going to read is always right there.
So in this picture, this is not necessarily an actual picture of a hoarder you knew.
No, that's an artistic rendering of hoarding.
Okay. Because that's what I was wondering. Because first of all, when I think of hoarders, this guy in this picture, like the promo picture, and he's holding your book.
Yes.
And like you said, in terms of books, they're just stacked and stacked. But in his case, I happen to notice they are very neatly stacked, and they're actually on shelves. Well, the hoarders I know, who I would call hoarders, and I know them, when you open the door to their apartment, there's no space to be seen. I know several people where when you walk in, you walk along a path, a tiny little narrow path, and then they tend to have somewhere like kind of a nest where they sleep, and that's it. The kitchen is completely head to toe, ceiling to floor, completely covered with stuff.
That's what we call probably close to a level 4 or 5 hoarder, depending on how wrecked the house has become, how dysfunctional. If you can't even get in to repair furnaces or water or other problems, that would be a level 5 hoarder. And often there's some animals creeping around in the mess as well. There was a famous story of hoarders in New York, the Collier Brothers, and it was really pretty tragic. One of the brothers needed some help or some food, and the other one tried to get out to save him, but I guess he had a heart attack on the way out. And it wasn't until neighbors noticed the odor coming from the apartment that the fire department finally broke in and discovered this horrible, horrible situation. So one thing you're describing is that some hoarders are actually neat. They're collectors, and they have shelves, and things don't exceed the containers that they're put into. But the other end of the spectrum is the messy hoarder, the one who does have both very little room to walk in the house, if any, and is probably suffering from some illness otherwise, in addition to having a house that's really dysfunctional.
I'd like to remind our listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Listen live online at www.nccradio.org or on iHeartRadio and other platforms as well. And for more information on today's guest or topic, send us an email at whpc@ncc.edu. And we're continuing with our discussion with our guest today, Dr. Deborah Greenhut, and she's got a lot of interesting information, and we're speaking today about her first novel and newest publication, which is called The Hoarder's Wife. So you just shared some information, Deborah, that I never heard before. I never heard of this thing that you shared about levels of hoarders. What is that about?
Well, I guess I think it was the OCD Foundation decided that it might be helpful for people to understand where they were, because early intervention, of course, is better than waiting until the last level. But at the first level is the least severe, and there are very few indicators. There might be some clutter in the house, but no one really thinks much of it. It's easy to move away. The second level, there's a noticeable object collection, and people are embarrassed when they have visitors over about it. They'll comment on it. And so it's really beginning at that level to be a problem. At the third level is when odors and poor hygiene and narrow hallways will be kicking in. And people often express disgust and stop coming around at that point. So if the person isn't intercepted, then the house begins to suffer some structural damage, and rooms become unusable. In the final level, it's a fire hazard. There's no electricity or running water, and there may be some accumulations of human waste that are just too horrible to contemplate. So a person who has to live there with the hoarder goes from annoyance to fear and terror if nothing is done. So it's a pretty frightening progression. And we know a little bit more about causes now, but we don't know exactly what is the cause. So it is difficult to treat.
Well, what are some of the proposed causes? Does it run in families?
It may. Early on, at least 20 years ago, when people started to work with hoarders, they thought it might be a comorbid symptom of OCD, of obsessive compulsive disorder. So it was treated mostly by therapists who worked on that. And the tool of choice became cognitive behavioral therapy. And they seemed to avoid psychotherapy. So at the time my husband was seeking help, that wasn't available. They said that would do nothing for it. More lately, just to quickly bring you up to date, trauma is being looked at as somehow a causative factor. Not everyone who suffers trauma becomes a hoarder, but it is one kind of response to that. And typically childhood trauma is in the background for people who experience it that way. There's also a theory, I think there was an NIH study about the connection between hoarding and the Holocaust. So what they're proposing from looking at survivors and their children is that the person's DNA in a Holocaust or a genocide or other forced migration because of tragedy, their own DNA gets rewired, and this may be passed along to their children. So it's a pretty frightening thing. And some of the causes are global and social, society beyond our control. But we need to pay a lot more attention to it because it's also connected with dementia. Older people who have dementia may become hoarders. And then it's very difficult to intervene. So some more medication treatments or additional psychotherapy and behavioral treatments need to be developed. And maybe there's even something else. We don't really know what will fix it altogether.
So that's really interesting what you shared, because you're talking about the fact that if somebody becomes a hoarder, it actually can affect their DNA. And that becomes more like a hardwired piece of information that could be passed down to future generations.
Yes, that is a frightening thought. And I think as the world becomes more authoritarian conscious, we need to look at this as a tragic consequence that we're all going to be living with if we don't change the world somehow soon. So it's pretty important.
Yeah, I actually never heard of that. I've heard of that genetic transference in other categories, but not in hoarding. So
yeah, there's just one study by the NIH, but they seem to feel that could be true. So
okay, it could be, but I'll just say my one experience from the person that I was describing, who's a woman that has her house, that you can't walk in, like you open the front door and everything falls out from the ceiling to the floor. I know her daughter, and her daughter is not a little girl. Her daughter is, in her late 50s, is the absolute opposite. Like, she actually does not even furnish her house except for the most bare minimum. And I always felt like that's a reaction to her mother's hoarding.
I think so. I think my children are both very neat. I can't say they were growing up all the time, but at this point, they seem to value having a clean and orderly house. It's very important to them. And I think that was a reaction to what happened in our home.
I think those definitions is interesting, like anything in psychological realm, where those lines are. Because I would say myself, I am not the neatest person in the world. And it drives my husband crazy because my husband wants, like, let's say there's papers on a table. First of all, he doesn't want them there at all. But if they're there, he'll come and line them up so that they match like the line of the table, not so that they're there just any kind of haphazard way. And I always tell him, you're like OCD about this. It doesn't matter if the papers are lined up or not. He said, you're right. I don't want the papers there at all. So I think people have, even living together, a lot of differences in what they can accept. It's not all the way to the line of hoarding, but you mentioned the word neatness.
Yeah. I think I'm a clutter bug myself. I don't mind a pile of papers on the table at all. And I often work at the table. So it doesn't bother me, but that's probably why I didn't recognize the problem until fairly much later in the game. We were both graduates. I was a graduate student. My husband was already a professor when I met him, and he was kind of the absent-minded professor. So I thought, well, the clutter goes with the territory. Unfortunately, it evolved into something worse.
So that's an interesting thing, because I actually do find that that's true, that very often people who are very, let's say, intelligent in terms of, being a professor, something like that, like you said, that is like a thought form that people could recognize.
Yes.
The professor like Einstein, who just, is all over the place and not particularly neat.
Right. It seems kind of charming at first, and there are all those funny movies about it, and it is comical for a while. But unfortunately, he also suffered from ADHD and a number of other disorders, apparently. And we don't know the chicken and egg of the hoarding, but eventually it became a big problem.
So you're talking about something that has a beginning and can become more problematic. And in your book, The Hoarder's Wife, this is not like a how-to self-help book, right?
No.
This is more what's going on in that relationship.
Yes.
And you talk about things like communication, as well as hoarding and relationships in the troubled family, and also women's issues. Why would it be a women's issue? I know certainly hoarders of both sexes.
There are, because I was talking about the failure of a marriage, and my own feeling of failure that I could never get it right. I felt that it was a woman's issue as a partner who gave up a career. My husband was very rigid about where we were going to live and whether we could move or not. So my academic career for a while actually went by the wayside. So in addition to giving up space and closets and everything else, I had to give up the career dream that I had for a very long time.
So in terms of the space in the closet, so is that like evolutionary? I mean, you said when you met your husband, he already was probably a hoarder, but perhaps you didn't recognize it, but then it got worse.
Right. I mean, I would say as we began to merge our households when we were getting married, I noticed that he took the larger room, even though he had an office at work. And as a graduate student, I did not. So he took the larger spare bedroom that we had, and I had basically a closet to work in, but I worked around it. But when we moved to our house, it seemed that there was never enough closet space for him, and he was always taking over another one, or any empty space on a table, he would put something on it, and he didn't want to see any empty tables or counters in the house. So at a certain point, even though we could still walk through the house, I felt like there were only certain places I could move because his stuff was beginning to block the way, or he wanted to reserve that space for himself. So it just became a kind of a chess game to the end, and eventually there wasn't a lot of space for me in there, and I felt really pushed out, and eventually I pushed myself out.
And what kind of stuff? I mean, are hoarders similar in what they like to collect, or is it an individualized issue?
Well, I think it's probably all over the map. My husband at first was collecting papers, and he would come home with tons of research papers to read. This is before internet, I guess, and students' papers that he needed to grade. And he'd come and go with the same bags every day. And eventually he would leave the shoulder bag that he brought with the papers, and it would never get touched again. And he would leave another one and another one. And finally, our front door was very difficult to get out of. And he would also not throw away mail. He couldn't discard any of that. So I think it started as papers, but he also had a collection of old broken screws in the basement that he wouldn't throw out. And I mean, by a collection, I mean quite a few, several bins full, and he kept adding to it. If he saw a discarded piece of wood on the street, he would bring that into the house because it might be good for kindling someday, except he never used the pile of kindling that he put in the basement. So of course, some little creatures started to inhabit that pile of wood as well. And eventually he was saving everything. He wouldn't let me throw away spoiled food. He would claim he was going to eat it, and sometimes he would. And I say most often he would, and it just became everything. Anything that came into the house could not go out. He would check the garbage if I put something out there. He wanted control of the garbage. I wasn't allowed to take it out, which some people might regard as, a gift. But it was because he didn't want any of it to go outside. So there was a lot of garbage around after a while. And eventually, and we don't even know where some of the things came from. He'd go to a convention and pick up thousands of little trinkets off the display tables and bring them home. He'd take an extra suitcase to fill it up while he was there, bring those home and strew them all over the living room floor. And we weren't allowed to move them. So he was building something, and it was completely dysfunctional for the family.
So it was something that, continued to evolve.
Yes.
And so you described what hoarding was like for you. Are there things that people can watch out for to see if this is something that's, invading their life? Like, what about people who just like to collect things?
Well, they say if you keep it neat and keep it in a cabinet and everyone can use and walk through the house, it's probably not hoarding. But I guess you have to look at that, from long-term perspective. There are famous people who've been hoarders. Elvis Presley would be a good example. I a couple of years ago went to the Elvis Museum in Memphis, and I could not believe how many cars the man owned. Now, he had a big property at Graceland, so he could have a separate building for them. So we might say he was not a hoarder, but the cars were only one kind of collection. And if you were wondering in your own house, well, how many forks or how many cars does someone actually need? That may be a sign that there's a hoarding problem there, especially if it's taking over your space as well.
Well, that's something. So if whoever you're sharing space with, if they're starting to take up a lot of it, then it's still hard to say what the line of hoarding is versus them collecting it. But you're saying if it's in a closet, but it's not out all over the place, then it wouldn't be considered hoarding.
That's the kind of official dividing line. But as I told you before, even in
what about, and I've seen this too, but you open the closet and stuff just falls out onto the floor where it's stuffed in there. It's not really on shelves and hung up and everything.
I would say if you can't easily put it back in the closet, or it simply stays there because the person who collected it won't pick it up, you have a hoarding problem.
Then trying to work with that person, I notice, to try to throw anything out. Like you can't throw anything out. Like, so I've sometimes tried a technique of making 3 piles. One is keep, one is get rid of, and then you have to allow them to have an intermediate pile I can't decide. But what happens, I find with people who really have that issue, it's like everything is either keep or can't decide. There's nothing they're willing to let go of. And, I've seen this in another whole community, which is called the prepper community. In the prepper community, they are sort of purposefully hoarding for the day when, water's not running anymore and electric isn't running anymore. And they feel that's pretty imminent at any second, which could be right. And in that case, it certainly could have been a great thing to have a whole bunch of cans of, vegetables or things like that stored.
Yeah, everything that you just said really attaches to the idea that hoarding is somehow based in trauma and anxiety, because it's completely irrational. If you say, well, you haven't used this knife for 42 years, it's been sitting in the drawer, could we discard it? And the person says, no, it isn't for any rational reason. It might not be useful someday if it hasn't been useful in 42 years. And I'm not exaggerating the time frame. And the problem is that forced cleanups do more damage to the person than anything else, because you're taking away their security blanket, basically. Just to borrow a metaphor there, I think it is like a security blanket to still have all those things. Now, I don't know about the prepper community. I don't think they're entirely wrong. Someday, we may be faced with some kind of crisis like that. So it's not a bad idea to store a certain amount of supply, but food goes bad. And if you don't,
where's the line? But thank you so much for being our guest today, Dr. Deborah Greenhut. And, very interesting topic, and best of luck with your new novel. And people can find out more, The Hoarder's Wife, at deborahgreenhut.com. And we also have these as live links. So thank you so much for listening to us today, all you Herbal Yours listeners. And Herbal Yours is produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.